We found her body by the riverbank, bloated and bruised. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone knew the land had claimed its first victim. The village of Amadi had always been a peaceful place. Located between two winding rivers and lush forests, it was a small, self-sustaining community. For generations, the villagers had lived off the land, farming their crops and fishing in the rivers. The land was fertile, and no one in the village ever went hungry. Life was simple and slow, just the way the people liked it. The village was home to two powerful families, the Okafors and the Nwakwas, both of whom had lived in Amadi for as long as anyone could remember. Though they came from different ethnic groups, this had never been a cause for conflict. The Okafors were known as hard-working farmers, their lands always full of crops. They were respected for their wealth and their generosity, often sharing their surplus with the rest of the village. The Nwakwas, on the other hand, had a long history of leadership in the village. They were the ones people came to for advice and wisdom. Many of the village chiefs had come from the Nwakwa family, and they were known for settling disputes and maintaining peace. It was said that without the Nwakwas, the village of Amadi would have fallen apart long ago. Despite the differences in their status, the two families had always lived in harmony. There were occasional disagreements, a cow wandering into someone else's field, a fishing net set too close to another's trap, but these were small things, settled with a handshake and a smile. The land was vast, and there was enough for everyone. But beneath this surface of peace, there were cracks. The Okafors and the Nwakwas had different ways of seeing the world. The Okafors valued hard work and believed that whoever tilled the land had the right to own it. The Nwakwas, however, believed in tradition. They claimed that the land had been theirs since their ancestors first settled in Amadi, and that the land could not be taken from them, no matter who farmed it. These were old arguments, whispered among the elders but never spoken aloud. And so the village lived on, peaceful on the surface, but with tensions simmering just below. The first sign that something was about to change came on an ordinary afternoon, when a group of strangers arrived in the village. They were men dressed in suits and polished shoes, driving shiny cars that kicked up dust on the village roads. The villagers had seen outsiders before, but these men were different. They carried briefcases and spoke in technical terms no one understood. They weren't traders or missionaries, they were something else entirely. The men said they were there to survey the land. They explained to the village chief that they were conducting studies for the government, looking for minerals and resources that might be hidden beneath the soil. The chief, an old man from the Nwakwa family, nodded along, though he didn't fully understand. The men stayed for a few days, walking the fields with strange equipment, marking the land with flags and stakes. When they left, they didn't explain what they had found. Life in Amadi went back to normal, though there was a sense of unease in the air. The villagers were used to outsiders passing through, but there was something different about these men. The chief sent word to the district office, but received no reply. Weeks passed, and the village continued with its farming and fishing, the memory of the strangers fading. Then one day, a government official arrived in the village. He came with news that would change everything. Oil had been discovered beneath the land. The oil, the official explained, was worth millions. If the village agreed to sell the land, they could become rich beyond their wildest dreams. At first, the village was stunned. Oil? Beneath their land? What did that mean for them? The villagers had always lived off the land, using it to grow their crops and feed their families. But oil? What would they do with oil? As the official explained the potential wealth that could come from selling the land, the excitement began to build. The villagers, many of whom had never seen more than a few coins in their lives, started to dream of what they could do with millions. They could build new homes, send their children to school, buy cars, and live lives of comfort and ease. But then came the question, who owned the land? The land in question was a large stretch of farmland on the outskirts of the village, bordered by the river on one side and the forest on the other. For as long as anyone could remember, the Okafor family had farmed the land, their crops providing food not just for their family but for the entire village. The Okafors claimed that the land was theirs because they had worked it for generations. But the Nwakwas had a different story. They claimed that the land had belonged to their ancestors long before the Okafors had even arrived in the village. The Nwakwas argued that the land was a sacred part of their heritage, passed down through the generations, and that it couldn't be sold or taken away. At first, the dispute was quiet, almost polite. The two families had always respected each other, and neither wanted to cause a scene. They met with the village chief and elders, hoping to come to a fair agreement. But the more they talked, the more it became clear that neither side was willing to compromise. The Okafors insisted that they had the right to the land because they had worked it for years. "We've tilled the soil, planted the seeds, harvested the crops," said Kelechi Okafor, the head of the family. "We've fed this village with the sweat of our brows. The land is ours by right." But Obinna Nwakwa, the eldest son of the Nwakwa family, disagreed. "The land belongs to our ancestors," he argued. "It was ours long before your family even came to Amadi. You may have farmed it, but that doesn't make it yours." As the weeks passed, the arguments became more heated. Villagers began to take sides. Some supported the Okafors, believing that those who worked the land should have the right to claim it. Others sided with the Nwakwas, arguing that tradition and heritage were more important than hard work. The village, once united, was slowly beginning to divide. As the dispute dragged on, whispers began to spread through the village. People said that the Okafors had secretly met with the government official, cutting deals behind the Nwakwas' backs. Others claimed that the Nwakwas were using dark magic to curse the Okafors, hoping to scare them off the land. These were just rumors, but in a village as small as Amadi, rumors had a way of taking on a life of their own. The village chief, an old man who had always been respected, tried to mediate between the two families. But even he seemed powerless to stop the growing conflict. "We are one community," he pleaded at a village meeting. "This land has sustained us all for generations. We must find a way to share it." But no one was willing to listen. Politicians from the nearby towns began to take an interest in the dispute. They saw an opportunity to gain influence by siding with one family or the other. One politician, Chief Obinna, who had connections with the Okafor family, promised them that he would support their claim in exchange for their loyalty in the upcoming election. In return, the Okafors agreed to rally the villagers to vote for him. Meanwhile, another politician, Senator Chukwudi, saw an opportunity to back the Nwakwas. He offered them legal support and protection if they agreed to support him politically. The Nwakwas, desperate to hold on to their ancestral land, accepted his help. The village of Amadi was now a battleground not just between two families, but between politicians and power-hungry outsiders. The once peaceful community was torn apart by greed and ambition. The first real violence came late one night, when a fire broke out in the Okafor compound. Flames engulfed the barn, quickly spreading to the surrounding fields. By the time the villagers arrived to help, it was too late. The crops, which had been the Okafor family's livelihood, were destroyed. The family's youngest son, Uche, had been badly burned trying to save the livestock. The Okafors were certain that the Nwakwas were behind the attack, though they had no proof. "They're trying to drive us off the land," Kelechi Okafor said, his voice shaking with rage. "They think they can scare us away, but we won't go." The Nwakwas denied any involvement, but the damage was done. Tensions, already high, erupted into open conflict. The following day, a group of Okafor men, armed with machetes and sticks, marched to the Nwakwa compound, demanding justice. When the Nwakwas refused to admit guilt, a fight broke out. The clash was brutal. Fists flew, machetes were swung, and blood was spilled. By the time the village elders managed to intervene, a young man from the Nwakwa family lay dead in the dirt, his head split open by a blow from a machete. The village had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the violence escalated, the government decided to step in. Soldiers were sent to the village to maintain order, but their presence only made things worse. The soldiers weren't interested in the land dispute, they were there to protect the oil. They set up checkpoints around the village, interrogating anyone who tried to leave or enter. The villagers, already on edge, now lived in fear of both their neighbors and the soldiers. The oil company, seeing that the village was too divided to ever resolve the dispute, made an offer directly to the government. They promised millions in exchange for control of the land, bypassing both the Okafors and the Nwakwas. The government, eager to start drilling, agreed. Within weeks, bulldozers arrived to clear the land, guarded by soldiers. The villagers, both Okafor and Nwakwa alike, were powerless to stop them. The land that had once been their source of life was now in the hands of outsiders. The Okafors and Nwakwas had lost everything in their fight for the land. Families that had once lived in harmony now avoided each other. The village of Amadi, once peaceful and united, was left in ruins. And so the land, once a symbol of life and sustenance, became a curse. The village had been torn apart, not by the oil beneath the soil, but by the greed, pride, and ambition that had consumed its people. It wasn't long after the soldiers arrived that things took a darker turn. The sight of uniformed men walking through the village streets, carrying guns and enforcing curfews, had made people fearful. Children who used to run freely in the fields were now confined to their homes. Women hurried through the market, no longer gathering to chat. It was as though the soul of Amadi had been drained from it. The Okafors and the Nwakwas had both lost in the struggle over the land. The promise of wealth from oil had faded into a nightmare of distrust and suspicion. The land that they had once called home was being bulldozed, its soil ripped apart by machines they didn't understand. But what hurt the most was how they had turned against each other. Despite their losses, there was one last hope, a final thread that both families clung to, the promise from the government that they would be compensated. The officials, realizing the conflict was growing beyond their control, had assured the villagers that both families would receive a portion of the wealth from the oil, enough to rebuild and move on from the devastation. But like many promises made by those in power, it was a lie. One morning, Kelechi Okafor was called to the district capital. He was told to bring the Nwakwa family with him, to sign a deal that would secure the future of both families. Though tensions were still high, Kelechi agreed to the meeting, hoping for a resolution at last. He sent word to Obinna Nwakwa, asking him to come to the district office, and for the first time in months, the two men spoke without anger. Obinna agreed. "For the sake of our children," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Let us put this behind us." But when Kelechi arrived at the district office, Obinna was not there. In his place, Kelechi found soldiers waiting for him. He was told that the government had already reached an agreement with the Nwakwas. The compensation that was supposed to be shared between the two families had been given to the Nwakwas alone. Kelechi couldn't believe what he was hearing. This must be a mistake, he argued, his voice trembling with rage. "We both worked the land. We both have a claim." But the officials didn't care. The deal had been made, and the Nwakwas were leaving Amadi with pockets full of government money, while the Okafors were left with nothing. The betrayal cut deeper than any machete ever could. Kelechi felt the weight of the years of toil on his shoulders, the decades his family had worked that land, only to have it snatched away in an instant. When he returned to the village, there was no one to meet him. The Nwakwas were already gone. Under cover of night, they had packed up what little they could carry and left Amadi for good, abandoning the village that had been their home for generations. They had escaped the coming destruction with money and their lives intact. The Okafors were left to face the collapse alone. The collapse of Amadi came quickly after the Nwakwa's betrayal. Without any claim to the land, and with no compensation from the government, the Okafor family was left destitute. Their fields had been bulldozed, their livestock scattered, and their barns burned to the ground. They had nothing left. But it wasn't just the Okafors who suffered. The entire village felt the effects of the land dispute. Neighbor turned against neighbor, old friendships were broken, and families who had once lived in harmony were now filled with mistrust. The young men who had taken sides in the conflict no longer spoke to each other, and old men sat on their porches in silence, mourning the loss of their community. Then came the soldiers. At first, they were only meant to guard the oil, to keep the peace as the government's machines tore up the land. But the more control the soldiers exerted over the village, the more brutal they became. They patrolled the streets with a heavy hand, arresting anyone who defied curfew or spoke out against the government's plans. They interrogated men and women alike, demanding to know who had started the fires and the fights, who had stirred the conflict. But no one could answer, because the true cause of the village's collapse wasn't in any one person. It was in all of them, in the greed that had taken root and the pride that had kept them from finding peace. The village had destroyed itself from within. The final blow came one afternoon when the soldiers, under orders from the district government, began to forcibly remove the remaining villagers from their homes. They said it was for their own safety, that the land was no longer theirs and they needed to make way for the oil companies to start drilling. Kelechi and his family resisted, but they were no match for the soldiers. They were dragged from their home, their few remaining possessions thrown into the street. As Kelechi was marched away, he looked over his shoulder at what was once the heart of his family's livelihood, the fields, now a wasteland of mud and machinery, and the river, once clear and full of life, now clogged with oil and debris. The Okafor family was gone, the Nwakwa family had fled, and the village of Amadi was nothing more than a memory. Years later, people would speak of Amadi as a place that had been cursed. They would tell stories of how the land, once fertile and full of life, had turned barren after the oil companies arrived. They would whisper about the ghosts that wandered the empty streets at night, the spirits of those who had died in the conflict, still searching for peace. But for those who had lived through it, the curse wasn't in the land itself. The true curse was in the hearts of the people who had let greed and pride tear their community apart. The oil beneath the ground had promised them wealth, but it had brought them nothing but sorrow. Kelechi Okafor, now an old man, sat by the riverbank where his family's fields had once thrived. The river, once the lifeblood of the village, was now a blackened stream of oil and waste. He thought of the Nwakwas, of how they had once been friends, and how they had turned on each other for the sake of land and money. He thought of the villagers who had fought and died for something that had never belonged to them in the first place. The land had claimed its victims, not with violence, but with greed. Amadi was gone, and with it, the people who had once called it home. The story of Amadi became a cautionary tale, passed down through the generations in the neighboring villages. It was a reminder of how easily greed could destroy even the most harmonious of communities. People spoke of the land dispute as a warning to those who might let pride and ambition blind them to what truly mattered: family, friendship, and the shared history that bound them together. But for those who had lived it, the story of Amadi was more than just a tale. It was a memory, a painful reminder of how everything they had once cherished had been lost. The oil beneath their feet had promised them the world, but in the end, it had only brought them ruin.